Were the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki justified? Raise your hand if you're really struggling with what the answer to that question is. Were there no other options for the Americans? Were there no other good options for the Americans to end the war in the Pacific? Was it really the best way to end that war, dropping nuclear bombs? So I grew up, I don't think I'm alone, kind of got the general impression from studies and stuff I read that, the Japanese were never going to surrender, that the only way for the Americans to end that war in a way that didn't result in the loss of thousands of more American lives was to drop the bombs. And so they were kind of like the best of a series of terrible options. And in that sense, they were justified. And I didn't question this when I was younger. You tend to not. And then as I grew up, I started to really struggle with this because I'm going to be totally honest about the fact that I can actually not think of a good justification for using nuclear weapons ever. And so that explanation has never sat well with me. I've gone and I've done sort of, anecdotal chats with people being like, what do you think? What were you taught? And I've heard a whole bunch of stuff that it was, revenge for the bombings on Pearl Harbor. And, in that sense, it was justified. And that the the government was going to fight until, thousands of more lives were taken. And in that sense, it was justified. And no explanation has ever sat well with me. It just doesn't have enough context to it. And as I started to research the topic, I found articles that hint that, state that, point to that the Japanese were in fact going to surrender. It's just they were going to surrender by working with the Soviet Union, not the Americans. And then I started to wonder if it was like, we got a little early Cold War tensions happening now. So what is the situation, right? Well, recently, I happened to go to the Hiroshima Peace Museum. It's an incredibly well-done museum, but it is incredibly horrific. It is one of the hardest things to walk through I've ever done in my entire life. The first part of the museum is devoted to August 6th. It's just what happens when a nuclear bomb is detonated above your city. And it's very graphic. It's very visual. My sense is that it's asking us to bear witness to what happens so that this kind of thing never happens again. There are pictures, there are stories, kids who lost parents, parents who lost kids, the devastation, the ongoing devastation, the people who died immediately, the people who died of radiation poisoning. There's an entire case of children's clothes covered in radiation burns. It is a very difficult museum to walk through. The last part of the museum, it's a very small part of it actually, is devoted to telling the story of why this bomb got dropped. And this museum is in Hiroshima. It's in Japan. So I thought the Japanese perspective on why this happened might be interesting because it was probably not the perspective that I had grown up with. And sure enough, the plaques, the descriptive plaques inside the museum state that at the Yalta Conference, the US, the UK, and the USSR, they agreed, based on an American request, that the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. However, after Germany's surrender in May, discord over the post-war handling of Europe raised tensions between the US and the Soviets. The US began worrying about the increased influence the Soviet Union would gain by joining the war against Japan. And moreover, the US knew from its signals intelligence that Japan was attempting a peace initiative via the Soviet Union, its partner in a neutrality pact. So this idea that Japan was going to fight to the death, maybe that's not true. It looks like, at least from the Japanese perspective, they were trying to work with the Soviet Union to surrender. They just weren't working with the Americans. The context in the museum goes on to say that the United States believed that ending the war with an atomic bombing before the Soviet Union declared war on Japan would curb Soviet influence after the war and justify the tremendous cost of development to the American people. Now, this is from the Hiroshima Museum. I'm not saying this is necessarily my perspective, but it is interesting that the the Japanese perspective thinks that a lot of the reason that bomb was dropped was to just justify cost to the American people. That's really hard to read. So I want to know more about this topic. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the bombings, maybe some, things that you've reworked in your mind over the years, any resources you can point to that have a more complex, nuanced perspective. Because I'm telling you, when I walked through that museum, I could not think of a reason ever in the world where it would be justified to drop another one of these bombs again. It was quite clear that the people of Hiroshima and surrounding area, they didn't know what hit them. The Americans did not say, hey, we have this crazy new technology. It's going to obliterate you in the worst possible way, so surrender. They didn't tell them that. They didn't detonate in a non-populous place to demonstrate the power of this bomb. They didn't even tell them that Hiroshima ended up being target number 1 so that the Japanese could start to evacuate. They just went and did it. And the results were, like I said, it's pretty hard to watch, pretty hard to see and bear witness to. So I think it's an important topic to talk about, given how nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons seems to be rising in the chatter again. I worry that this is one of those things where we've forgotten, we forget what actually it was like. And of course, the nuclear weapons we have now are far, far more powerful than the ones they had then. So hit me, thoughts, comments, share resources. This is something I really want to learn more about. And I'm genuinely interested in your perspective, if it's changed, if it hasn't, what you were taught, what you believe. I think this is an important one to dive into. So let me know. Otherwise, I hope everyone's managing to have a good day.